And we are right.
1, 2, 3, testing.
We can hear you.
Thank you.
Okay,
4, 5,
we are
6,
right.
testing complete.
Now we can start. So we're half past the hour, and welcome everyone. This is the core session at IETF117. I'm Marco Tilocca. My co-chairs, both attending remotely, are Jaime Jimenez and Karsten Bormann. We assume people present here, especially in the interest of the expected discussion, to have read the documents in the agenda for today. The goal is to do good use of our time, especially to solve open issues. And the note well applies as per the next slide. The blue sheet is collected automatically if even on-site you log into Miteco. So please do, and please help circulating the blue sheet with the QR code for logging into Miteco for the on-site participants. Thank you, Hank. Yes, and we have two note takers, Richard and Christian. Thank you very much for helping anyone helping them. It's much appreciated. And this is an official IETF meeting, so the note well applies. Be familiar with that if you're not already. It's not about IPR patents and so on. It's also and especially about our code of conduct. So please be nice and professional with each other. A few practicalities. Of course, this meeting is recorded. For the on-site participants, again, please remember to sign in using the QR code on the screen or manually from the browser. For joining the queue, please join the queue first on the app and then go to the mic. For remote participants, just use your audio and video if you are presenting or actively speaking. And you can ask, in case to relay a question, just typing that in the chat, prepared by Mick or something like that. So the agenda for today starts with the usual update from the chairs, and then we have Karsten presenting the progress on the CoreConf documents and on HRF, Martina presenting the NS over co-op, and Christian with some updates following interim meetings, especially on attacks on co-op. Richard presenting updates on kudos and on score-capable proxies. And finally, Christian has some updates on co-op over GATT, and the on-site presenters should be only Richard and Martina. Does anyone want to bash this agenda? Heard none. Let's start with the usual updates from the chair. We have one document in IETF last call, started 2 days ago, core target at, for which Karsten already addressed the AD review from Rob Wilton, so it's proceeding well. We have a number of documents in post working group last call processing. Actually, there were 2 versions of the group of score document recently submitted, addressing especially the Shepherd review from Christian and additional discussion points that came up following that up. So the authors believe that is now aligned with what requested in the Shepherd review, and it's again in the Shepherd's hands for the next steps. Coros Coredoc is also waiting for Shepherd read up and actual Shepherd review, and that's for Karsten to take care of. Then this slide is about a CoreConf, about which Karsten will talk more in the dedicated slots, and 2 of these slides are in the agenda for today. We still have a seed on version 20, for which we expect to have anyway a next working group last call, and Komai, for which version was submitted recently and for which we also expect anytime soon working group last call, possibly in parallel with the one for SID. Young libraries technically waiting for Shepherd read up, but we just have to wait for the previous 2 documents to move forward, and most likely we'll get a new working group last call for that too. And more, we have group combis for a while in post-working group last call because we're still waiting for some expected editorial comments and for a follow-up on the comments from the working group last call if they have been properly addressed or not. And the Shepherd is expected to be Karsten. For conditional attributes, we know from Bill that he's planning to submit a new version 7 anytime soon. After this meeting, we completed the working group last call. The next version to come should not address all the comments. As far as we know, there will be more work left to do, but it is expected already to indicate that the document, as discussed and confirmed on the list, is switching from informational to standard track. And the Shepherd is already appointed to be Jaime. And then we have href that was in Karsten.
Yeah, I just would like to add that there has been some activity on the ISG side. Maybe Murray knows more about that. Looking at the IPR issue, this draft is pretty interesting because it was split at some point at its life. And it turns out that the IPR stuck with one side, but when you look into the data tracker, then of course you still see the IPR on the other side. So I think there will be some discussion of this by the IETF Council, trying to find out what we can do about the current situation.
Yes, and thanks for checking about that, Karsten. Okay, then we have href, which is also in the agenda for today, and it was in working group last call till yesterday. So we can consider that completed. The revision will be expecting. It was mostly about positive feedback from Thomas on the list. I provided a review. I think Christian also wanted to give some comments. I suppose they will come soon and can be addressed as part of the last call processing. Can you confirm that, Christian?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. But we'll see more about that later in the slot. More documents. There was a recently updated working group document, OSCORE key limits that happened to be split out from the main kudos draft, key update for OSCORE. Now it's an informational document on its own, got updated, not in the agenda for today. After IETF117, there was a document adopted, performance measurement for co-op, and the authors plan a submission on version 1 in the next weeks. That was their plan. Then we have a document, group com proxy for a while pending and working group adoption. It's version 8 formally, but since version 6, when that sort of trajectory was talked about, there are no real changes. It was just resubmissions to keep the document alive. More documents, updated individual submissions. 2 of these are in the agenda for today. That's OSCORE capable proxies and COP over GATT that we mentioned before. There were also updates on cacheable OSCORE, mostly top to bottom editorial revision. And then Karsten revived the core CLAR draft, also in the interest of a discussion we plan to have about that topic later this week at an informal side meeting, but we have more information about that also later on. Okay, speaking of which, we have scheduled an informal, always discussion-oriented side meeting for core this Friday at the, well, first session slot, basically, also thinking of local time, but same time of today for core, just 90 minutes. For those of you here on site, it's in Golden Gate 4. We'll try to use Miteco. The room is scheduled already. In case of any issue, I think we can quickly resort to something else like Jitsi and so on. The goal is to focus the discussion, especially on co-op non-traditional responses, for which, well, we have a document that was discussed in a number of interesting recent interim meetings. And it's mostly to understand better what trajectory that can take, also in relation with other documents or RFCs that are using, had used that sort of concept. And And time allowing, we plan also to get back to the core-clar document mentioned before as the trajectory the document can take, should take for providing clarifications and corrections about co-op. Time allowing, Karsten proposed also something related to locally significant URIs. I think also related to something that Christian recently introduced in co-op over GATT. But you can find some more information, including this, in the entry in the wiki page for the side meetings of IETF117. And last but not least, we also had a consensus call on the list with no objection about resuming the core interim meetings according to the usual cadence, alternating with CBOR every other Wednesday, and on the odd weeks, same time as usual, so the European afternoon. So having heard no objection, the chairs will proceed with booking the interim meetings after the session or later this week anyway. And see you there. We plan to resume on August 30. Okay, are there any questions or comments on the working group at a high level? If none, then we can start with the first presentation, and we have one already 3+ minutes. And Karsten, the floor is yours. If you're talking, we cannot hear you, Karsten, and you look like muted.
That is actually true. I'm for once using the old interface again. The new interface is so great, but I don't know how to do the document management in the old interface. So sorry for being a bit slow here. So the first set of documents is the core-conf set. We have one RFC in this space. We have one document that we sent to the ISG and got back. We are trying to react to improved understanding of Yang in this space. So the remaining task is to actually extract all the identifiers from a Yang document. I'll talk about that in a minute. We have a working group last call passed in core COMI and probably want to do another one. And we have a document that we probably will just revisit after all these delays. So let me quickly talk about core SID. So as I said, the remaining item is to make sure that the example we have in this document actually lists all the data node identifiers that this example contains. So we are going to use the pyang tool for that. We actually used that before, but we find that it doesn't spit out all the identifiers we want. And Laurent is sitting in the first row as somebody who actually has hacked pyang a little bit already. And my plan was to get people from Laurent's group to actually work with me and fix this so we can use this, but that hasn't happened. So the last throw was we were going to do during the hackathon, but again, I didn't manage to get this going. Eric, who is currently Eric Winke, who's currently the responsible AD for this document, even though it has been sent back to the working group, prognosticized that we probably will have Francesca back before we get this done. I still hope he's false, but the probability that he's true is increasing. So Laurent, if I talk to you this week, I hope you have some time to help me finishing this. So this is the core SID document. The other one is the COMI document, which really is the next one in line. But that actually did receive some attention and some increased Yang know-how. So when I talk about Yang know-how, all these documents are in a big abyss between the core working group and the NetMod, NetConf management working groups. And of course, all the questions we had about working in a constrained environment, co-op and so on, those we were able to process, but it takes a little bit longer to find answers to the Yang issues, and that's why I'm mostly going to talk about Yang issues, even though these are really not the one that this working group should be working about. Anyway, what was missing from the document was an RPC example. So Yang has two different forms of remote invocation. There is something called remote procedure call, or RPC, and there is something called action, which is really a remote method invocation on a specific object, while an RPC is something that's a procedure independent of an object. And the document had an example which was labeled as RPC example, but really it was an action. So I wrote an RPC example and looked at the interaction, and it turned out it really needed the identifiers that we don't get from CORE-SID at the moment. So I looked more closely and found out that these identifiers actually are redundant. So the whole thing can be done without actually giving these identifiers. So RESTconf, the HTTP version of what COMI does send these identifiers. So they are nested in the RPCR action, and then you get the actual data. But the COMI document now says just don't send them. And this means the COMI work can proceed without waiting for those identifiers. And then unexpectedly, we got an IANA early review, which pointed out that if you want to get an Yang module registered as an IETF module with IANA, you not only have to register a URN for that, but also a module name. So with that friendly information, I submitted -15, which is a new version just for this IANA early review. And they finally nailed down the terminology. So I'm using now the official terminology IANA uses for registries. So this is all work I did. I still have to check with my co-authors. Are we ready for the final working group last call that will allow us to ship this to the ISG again? So that's really the next step. And for CORE-SID, the next step is probably some 10 or 15 lines to be added to PYang to get these other identifiers out there. Questions? Laurent says he wants to work on this. Very great. Okay, so let me go to the next slide, which is the href document. And just as a reminder, we called it href because we couldn't decide how the things are going to be called. We finally called them CRIs, but the name stuck, the document name stuck. So I apologize for any confusion that comes with that. And the basic idea is to build on what we did 10 years ago, a couple more than 10 years ago in COAP. We normally don't send the actual URIs over the wire, but we parse the URIs and send the raw information that is in the URIs over the wire. But we do this in a very core-specific way. So the observation was that all of our application protocols carry URIs, and it would make sense to be able to send parsed URIs in the application protocols as well. We try to extract the data model that is behind URIs, and that's an interesting undertaking. And came up with a SIBO representation of the data model, which is called CRIs. And just as we have URI references with URIs, which are relative URIs, we have CRI references with CRIs. So one problem I think now have under control is numeric identifiers for URI schemes. URI schemes are character strings, and we had some 10 URI schemes that had numbers, and we now have decided let's just do numbers for all of them. So there is an appendix that has all the current URI schemes and a number assigned to them. I just updated that a couple of hours ago. So this is well understood. Yeah, we now have a current version that has a lot of little editorial things that went through Working Group last call, which lasted until yesterday. And what we now have is we have an extensive review from Marco, which is great. The processing is ongoing. There's one last item we have to nail down, and then we probably can finish this PR number 75. And what Marco found was there was some confusion between the terms CRI and CRI reference. I think the authors can plead guilty on that one, because we originally just called everything CRI, whether it was an actual CRI or a CRI reference, and then we tried to pull this apart editorially, and we didn't quite succeed everywhere. There are lots of other editorial nits that I don't want to list because I really want to focus on one remaining question, which is the representation of empty paths in CRIs. And one little problem that Marco shone a light on here is that the draft has some text that explains how a CRI reference in transfer form gets ingested and later gets exported again to the wire format. But we don't have a similar section for CRIs themselves. And CRIs benefit from being able to leave out parts of the defined structure if they are null, if they are absent, if they're not necessary. So for an absent path, which we have in many situations, not the least being the use of DNS, CORP over DNS, being able to transfer a null saves a byte. So that's not the world, but it's also not completely irrelevant. And so the question is whether we can, we want to stick with a natural representation of zero path elements, which is just an empty array, or whether we want to actually translate this into a null and essentially remove it from the data structure before interchanging it. And I think we had some discussions that unearthed the preference for null, but that hasn't completely been reflected in the recent changes to the document. So I was hoping we can verify this today and then make the change in one direction or the other direction, get it consistent again. Laurent.
Yes, so that's a very interesting issue. We have the same with SHIC. If we want to sign a rule, then we have to make the difference between an empty array and null. So maybe we can align on what you will select.
Okay, can you point us to the document that has that?
There is no yet document, but it's something we will have to sign the rule, and so we need to have a very strict representation of the rule, and this is one ambiguity we found when we serialize it.
So you don't have a document yet you could point to that has a representation of the rule?
Yes, but we have some time empty table, and so we have to decide which way we go, if it's empty table or null. So I think we will align on your representation.
Yeah, that would be very good. Any other comments on this? Christian.
No, I'd raise my hand. I'm just in the list because I can't get to the unmute button fast enough with all the note taking.
But do you have an opinion on this?
No strong one in particular, because if I remember correctly, the normalized form of a co-op URI would have a slash at the end anyway, and while co-op doesn't make that difference, in CRIs you can make that difference, and you would probably want to transfer the normalized version, which then makes the benefit would not make any difference anymore for whether it's null or an empty array.
Yeah.
Yeah, as an individual, to answer the question in the slide, definitely preference for null in the interest of the elision. Also thinking of some comments around documents around in core that plan to use CRIs as a replacement to a text string URI now. And yeah, if we shave some bytes, it's just better.
Okay, so Christian is not against doing this, but points to possibly limited gains because co-op URI is normalized to having a slash, so you have 1-0 path element, which on the other hand in co-op is defined to be identical semantically to not having a path element. And yeah, we can shave off this byte by not sending around these URIs in normalized form. Okay, so I take this as a definite maybe, but since I'm also a little bit in the shave the bytes camp, I will implement this by actually sending a null in all these cases, and I need to find out how to actually do this editorially because that information is a little bit distributed in the document. Okay, so the plan is to actually submit a -14 after we have satisfied Marco that we have addressed his comments. And of course, if there are any other late working group last call comments, we will look at them. So you haven't missed the bus here if you missed the deadline yesterday. But please do send them quickly so we don't have to wait for the IETF last call fixing those. Good. I think I'm done.
Thank you, Carsten. Nothing else in the chat, no one in the queue. Okay. We are very much ahead of time, which is good just in case. Yeah, I'm surprised. Which is good in case we need some discussion on some topics later. But the next is DNS over co-op. Martina.
Hello, I'm Martin Lenders, and I'd like to talk about DNS over co-op. For those still not in the loop, we're trying to provide encrypted name resolution for the IoT, and our solution there is to use DNS over co-op. Besides the encrypted communication, we then also have blockwise transfer to come pass MTU problems, and also share system resources with a co-op application, which gives us some resource advantages. We finally are on the track to publish our evaluation of DNS over CoAP. I think the most interesting result of that is that with OSCORE you actually can save a lot of memory, especially in the ROM. And if you are interested in the full evaluation, it will be published at ACM CONEXT this year, and there is also preprint available on archive. So how does this draft relate to the DNS CBOR draft I presented yesterday in CBOR? This draft, DNS over CoAP, provides a content format for the application DNS message media type, which was introduced in the DNS over HTTPS RC. It is basically just a classic wire format put into a CoAP message, and thus it is easily transferable to other DNS transports. However, if you look at it in general, it's sometimes not small enough, even with the classic name compression you have in DNS messages. So we decided to provide a CBOR-based format, which, as I said, presented yesterday. It is more concise, by in the first place using CBOR and also omitting some of the redundant DNS fields, like, for example, most of the traffic is quad A record requests or A record requests in the IoT, so it is basically implied if you just get a name in a CBOR array, it's a question for an A record, quad A record. And it is more compressed by having an optional support for packed CBOR. But we still like to use application DNS messages to have a fallback. First of all, if the application doesn't support this DNS plus CBOR format, or which might sometimes also be the case that the CBOR format is actually larger than the wire format. Since the last IETF, we added some recommendation on that the root path should be used as a DNS resource path for the doc server. We rationalized why we did all this TTL rewriting, which gives us some caching advantages when we have en route caches on the CoAP level. And we added an implementation status section where we added our implementations. And then we had an interim a few weeks ago where I basically presented most of this stuff already. But since then, we also clarified the mapping between DOC and DOH, which is basically just to use the DNS forwarder and not try to use some CoAP to HTTP proxy to maybe get some advantages out of that. But that's basically just too complicated. Then we set the content format for the application DNS message format. During the interim, it was still yet another number. Now it's 553. And we also clarified very prominently that it's disjunct from DOH, so that it's not the same protocol just on CoAP. And we also added a recommendation not to use unencrypted modes of CoAP, but provided some security considerations for that in case you want to do that. Then there's still some open discussion regarding the service B records, so how to find DNS over a CoAP server. And basically, we came to the conclusion that at least for TLS, there is an ALPN already existing, but for DTLS, it doesn't work. At least it was decided that we keep it for TLS only and need a new ID for DTLS. And for OSCORE/ad hoc, there is basically no such thing in the scope at the moment. So there is some draft on that maybe needed to discover DNS over CoAP resources. But in the end, we don't think that the doc draft itself is probably not the best place for this. And for next steps, we basically only wait on this service B record discussion. And if there's any other feedback, please give it. And yeah, our last thing is what needs to be done before the working group last call. Okay.
Thanks. Ben?
Hi, Ben Schwartz, Meta. So thanks for thinking carefully about all that feedback and finding ways to incorporate it. I appreciate it. I noticed in this presentation your discussion of application DNS CBOR. That's something that I've never heard about. And that's a little surprising because I do follow the DNS op mailing list. I think that there's a process question here where there's some history of people trying to, including me, trying to define alternative representations for the DNS queries and responses. And those have been fairly contentious. And it's in general as a matter of process that I think needs to happen in DNS op, because those, especially representations that subset the capabilities of the DNS format, have implications for the DNS system generally.
As I pointed out on my slide, it's not meant to replace the wire format, but use a concise method to send it, and you can still use the wire format as a fallback. So
I suspect that this is a topic that's going to be of great interest to DNS op. And so I would encourage you to bring it there and get that feedback early.
Yeah, I mean, during the hackathon, I made some first implementations of that, and I noticed that the draft still needs a lot of work. So I guess we then probably will definitely keep DNS op in the loop about that.
Great. As for the interaction with service bindings, I'm happy to try to help provide more assistance to come to the right conclusion there. But I don't know the answer myself because I don't know anything about how CoAP is normally used.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Any other question?
Karsten is in the queue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I joined the queue for something else, but I think from the point of view of getting this work done, I think it's a good thing to first do the DNS and CBOR work in the context of the CBOR working group, because we first have to find out what we actually get. So we want to do this in a way that we don't do a lot of additional programming for DNS. So we want to use CBOR and CBOR packed as much as that works for this application. I think we need to complete that work so we know what we actually get from that, and then can go into DNS op and see how that would be received. Benjamin, do you want to reply to this directly?
Hi, Ben Schwartz again. Yeah, so this isn't DNS op or CBOR, so maybe this is the wrong place for the discussion. But I think especially with these questions about compactness and efficiency, DNS is usually not the long pole in your diagram. It's not the big wedge in your pie chart of where the traffic is. So shaving off 50% of your DNS bytes is not likely to save you more than 1% of your total system bytes.
Now the problem is, because DNS is involved a lot in bootstrapping, is that if you're working, for example, in low power area network, wide area networks, where you have very long latencies, yes, it's a small part of the pie chart, but it's still significant for the communication part, especially if you go to sleep a lot. So, yeah.
If you, for example, if you have sort of an example system deployment, or even maybe measurements of an overall system where you can show that actually DNS actually is a big component of the total throughput pie chart. I think that's something that DNSOP would love to see and would motivate
I
a
mean,
compressed representation.
That's not what I said, that it's a big part of the pie chart, but it's still, even though it's not a big part of the pie chart, it can have a significant impact then.
Because it's a little unclear to me. It sounds like you might be saying that this is because of a synchronization effect, where there's a lot of DNS.
No, if you
queries
have
at
like a
once.
sleeping node on a LoRa link, for example,
Yeah.
that needs to bootstrap every time it wakes up,
Right.
then it has to do some DNS requests, and if these DNS requests are larger than a normal LoRa payload, then you have to wait a long time just for the name resolution, and that's why we want to get it so small.
Okay, that's interesting. So that's really about wake time. more
Latency
than-
is the game. Yes.
It's the latency of the LoRa link is the problem.
Okay, and your sense is the fragmentation actually introduces significant latency
Yes.
there.
Oh yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
So just to give a little bit background, since we're in the core working group, the core working group has worked a lot to ensure we can run our systems without DNS, so we never run into this kind of problem. But of course, it's a meaningful thing to enable applications that do use DNS. So this is just a very obvious thing to do. Yes, constraint systems have very different performance requirements from the large DNS server environments that you probably are discussing in DNSOP.
Yeah, I think, that's a really interesting set of use cases and parameters, and I think it would be great to sort of bridge that gap and help the broader DNS community understand this category of use cases and get more input about how we can tune the system to work well for your cases.
Yep. Carsten had another
Okay,
comment.
now to my real question. You had this recommendation for using an empty path for a DNS resolver.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether we are doing this recommendation in a BCP190 compatible way. So there is an RFC that is a BCP and tells us we have to avoid nailing down paths in our documents because the server should be free to decide. And I just wanted to verify that we do this right.
It's just a recommendation to use a port path. There's no say use this, but with a reasoning why it's best to use the default path because it saves byte in the header. It just says, we recommend to use the default path, the root path. Sorry.
Yeah, the question really is the strength of this recommendation. If you only can get implementations that actually do that,
I mean, that's a little bit from what I heard about DNS over HTTPS. Basically, there in the examples, there's a specific URI used, and the result is that all the implementations then use this path, which is not ideal because it actually was never standardized. But maybe you can say something about that, Ben?
I could.
Ben Schwartz, I would say about 80% of deployed servers happen to have chosen essentially a path that was mentioned in one of the examples in the RFC.
That's what I read in papers as well. So yeah.
And there's certainly a temptation to start pinning that path in different places. We've managed to avoid that.
So yeah, and that's basically why I put that in there. So basically to encourage people to maybe use the root path to save the bytes. But if we say, hey, this is maybe too dangerous, so that or people will then think that the root path is required, we can also remove it again.
Yeah,
Don't mind the countdown. We have time.
Okay.
May I jump in here?
yes, please.
Christian, I think we'll have another look at the wording, but generally this path is discovered, and I think this document can, even with that recommendation, still follow what we've done earlier in resource directory, that is, have a suggested kind of have values that are examples. In this case, we'll also say that it's a good idea to use those values, but still emphasize that it still has to be discovered.
Yeah,
I don't think we can do any better, because we'll have examples in there, and if even an example can send the temptation to ossification, I'm like, we can't avoid that.
Yeah, maybe you can have at least one example that actually uses a different path. I just want to make sure that we use language that indicates it is the server's decision, and the server's decision is discovered by the client, and clients are supposed to be agile and actually use the discovered path and not assume that the path is empty. So that was all that I wanted. So it's not a technical issue, it's an issue of editorially bringing this out in such a way that people understand it. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Any more questions?
None in the chat. None in the chat.
Okay.
At least.
Then thank you.
Thank you, Martina.
So I think it's my turn now. Hello.
Yes, hi, Christian.
I'd like to give you an update on what is happening around attacks on co-op. So as we haven't had this document around in recent IETF meetings, I'll give you a very brief history rundown. This happened like 6 years ago or so. There used to be two documents, co-op actuators and request tag, that both described things that can go wrong even when using co-op properly, and provided the relevant mitigation. Back then, it was decided to turn things around, to have one document that is talking about the attacks and another document that is providing the solutions. Now, the solutions, that document has eventually become Echo Request Tag and finally RC9175. And co-op actuators was left sitting for a while and was essentially now taken up again as attacks on co-op. What the document intends to say is that even when you're using co-op with the state-of-the-art security methods, and assuming that the encryption, etc., has not been broken, in which case we couldn't do anything anyway, that then there are still these and those pitfalls to look at, and that can be avoided by what is defined in other documents. And what we thought a few weeks ago was that, yep, now that 9175 is out, we can do that. Quite at the point where we have all the things to point to. So John has brought up something already in the 9175 review, but got lost a bit there. So the rough interaction was that he found an issue, and after a lot of back and forth, I found how I misunderstood how 7959 works, and we might need to do a bit more here. Now, the rough shape of the attack is that we have an attacker that can intercept the message, prevent it from being received by the recipient, and then replay it later. That's something where replay protection won't help us. So if a client is sent, and the thing that we've already mitigated in 9175 is that if this is happening somewhere where there is a lot of block 1 transfer going on, and then there is a block 2 phase, now things can't get mixed up because there's a request tag on that ties together the different messages in the block 1 phase. What is happening in the attack shown here is that there is no block 1 phase, but there is still a request payload, or a full request body actually in the original request, and then the remainder of the response body is fetched by additionally requesting block 2 parts. And those requests later, this post request on a new token that is asking for the block 2 of that resource does not send the request payload anymore. So there could be a mix-up between two requests, of which one has been essentially interrupted and cancelled by the foe, by the attacker, and they can then inject that message later to cause confusion. So what can we do about this? There are roughly 3 proposals around, and personally, I'm not sure yet whether all of those, whether any or all of those adequately address this yet. One is to extend these cases in which the client has to send a request tag. So previously, this was only mandated for cases when the client is sending the request in a fragmented way. Now it would also be included if the client, if there was any chance that the response is fragmented and there is a request payload in requests of that shape. Impact-wise, this is almost trivial on OSCORE because OSCORE rarely needs to use any request tag other than the absent one. In practice, because a constrained implementation can't track too much of those details, an implementation in DTLS would essentially need to send a request tag with every request that can have both a request payload and a response payload. I don't have numbers on how bad that really would be, but I'm not sure whether this completely addresses the issue either, or whether it's the easiest solution either. So this is up for further experimentation, further exploration in this document or others. A variant of that is that the server could send a request tag in the original, or in the first response, and then the client would use that request tag to pull out more blocks. It's certainly efficient on the wire. It does introduce state on the server, so for the moment, I'd keep this as one of the options that are around. Sorry. Yeah, and then there is a third option that also is not completely sure yet. That would be to add constraints on where the same e-tag and where different e-tags have to be used in situations of requests with the request payload, and that might also be sufficient. So that's where we are right now. Roadmap going forward is to take the examples that we currently have, turn them into a minimal example or a set of minimal examples that cover the whole problem area, and then evaluate whether the proposed solutions, once they have a bit more text around them, really work for them. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to rush attacks on CoAP through without having a solution at least adopted by the working group. So I think the document is stalled until we have clarity there. That's it from my side. Questions, comments? More things we missed?
Carsten?
Yeah, I find this interesting because we are in this transition away from using GET for everything towards no longer jamming all the information into the URI, but use fetch. And fetch, of course, has a request payload. And that is usually not a monster. So it uses the fact that it can be binary. So you can use something like CBOR for framing the data. but it might not actually be much larger than the, or even smaller than the URI parameters would have been. That's actually an optimization. And if we now trigger additional mechanics from that, I'm wondering where this will lead us.
Things would certainly have been easier if blockwise were done in a way that in a combination of no block 1 but present request payload and block 2, then then just the request payload would be sent again, because that might actually be shorter than all the workarounds we have to do now.
Yeah, can we fix that?
Can we fix that? Possibly yes. The question is, what are the guarantees that we give on option numbers that are out there? So procedurally, we could just say that, yep, we are doing an update to 7959. We subtly change the behavior of block 1, block 2. Chances are that implementations are either susceptible to the current issues anyway, and already have kind of, or might even already be broken, or they'll just tolerate it. But it's a breaking change that we would introduce on an option that is already around. If that is something that we are happy to do, my impression was that we don't do that, but maybe we do. In that case, yeah, that would be a fix that I'd appreciate. Not only because it fixes this particular issue, but because it allows a stateless implementation of fetch operations on the server in the presence of block 2 parts.
I don't want to design this thing in this meeting, but just as an example, let's assume we do an elective option that a client can use to indicate that he is ready for a new way of doing block 2. And that would be a 1-byte option. And the server could have a 1-byte option to say, oh yeah, sure, I can do that too. Would this be a breaking change then?
No, that would not be a breaking change. But it would just be using one more kind of. It would be using an option out of, yeah. It would be using one of the cheap options.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe we should try to design a fix for 7959 in competition with a workaround, and see which one hurts more in the end.
There's one more thing that might be worth looking into. That is, I don't think we've ever done large interrupt testing on 7959. Interoperability, given that I was wrong about this, and I have implemented at least one moderately widespread co-op implementation that does blockwise. So I don't know how much it would be actually breaking.
Okay.
And not only was I wrong, like nobody spotted it in 9175.
Yeah, the problem, of course, is that 7959 was before we did fetch. So the kinds of applications probably shifted under our hands. So that's maybe why we didn't think about that such one.
Yeah,
so
back then, combining block 1 and block 2 was like the examples we had were SOAP style requests, and my impression is that nobody here likes those anyway. So those were treated a bit like second-class things, possibly.
Okay. Thank you.
Just one question, Christian. On the document you have in mind to sketch the solutions to work on, looking forward to that, by the way. You mentioned what you would update. So I understand 9175, but why you said maybe also 9177? Wouldn't it just inherit
because
the
91.7 it's a maybe. If it doesn't need to be updated, it's fine. I don't know the precise statements that are in there on how request tag needs to be used there. If it's using it in a way that just inherits the update, it's fine.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Any more comments or questions exactly for Christian? Heard and seen none. Then we are 10 minutes ahead of schedule. And next is Rickard with kudos to start with. Ooh. Present yourself.
Yes, you can share.
Should I? Yeah, sure. You just tell me next.
Right, can you reset the timer, please?
Yep.
Right. So hello everyone, my name is Rickard Höglund and I would like to present updates to this draft, key update for OSCORE that we have titled Kudos. Next slide, please. So just to recap what this is about. This document used to be structured into 3 separate parts, of which one part has been now extracted. So the first part is about the actual core functionality of the document, which is the Kudos key update for OSCORE procedure, which has as purpose to renew the OSCORE master secret and master salt, thus deriving new sender and recipient keys for OSCORE. And it has some beneficial properties, including achieving perfect forward secrecy and also not changing the ID context, which is an OSCORE specific identifier that can be preferable to leave unchanged in certain contexts. It's loosely inspired by the Appendix B2 procedure that's been defined in the OSCORE RFC. That's also about performing a key update. So that's part 1. The core functionality of this. Then we had part 2, which covered the key usage limits in OSCORE, and that is guidelines based on a document in CFRG detailing how many times it's safe to use a specific key before you need to rekey to not lose security properties of your AAD algorithm. But what has been decided and confirmed during previous meetings is that we decided to split that content out, and this document has indeed been split and is now living in a separate informational document that is also being worked on. And then we have part number 3, which is about updating OSCORE sender and recipient IDs, where essentially your peers wish to get new values for their sender and recipient IDs to continue communication. And this is done to a co-op option. Yeah, next slide, please. So just as an overview of the Kudos procedure, you can see that on the right-hand side. On a high level, it's about an exchange of nonces, N1 and N2, placed in a new field in the OSCORE co-op option that we have extended. And then we have an internal function called update CTX that practically takes as input the nonces, the old context information, including the old master secret and master salt, and also an X byte, which contains certain flags and the length of the actual nonces. And this X byte is also present in the extended OSCORE option. Yeah, next slide, please. And just to start going over some updates since IETF117. The first thing that we've done here is we extended the considerations regarding minimum nonce size to make it clear that, well, each pair produces a random nonce value, and we now also recommend that 8 bytes nonce shall be used. And based on feedback from some people, we also now make it clear that, yes, there could be situations for very constrained devices where they really need to use a smaller nonce size, and that is acceptable as long as your overall security level in the system is at a sufficiently high level. And we also mentioned some more considerations on like risks of collisions and the birthday paradox and such. Another point is we clarified what information you need to write to non-volatile memory, because if your device reboots, well, you need to have stored away a certain set of information to be able to use Kudos in the forward secrecy mode. And basically what you need to store is all the immutable parts of the OSCORE context. But if you want to be clever, you can exclude some things that you are able to rederive from other parts of the OSCORE context. And we also covered some general improvements of corner cases and specific scenarios that may occur and how you should handle those things. For instance, if a kudos execution fails, the client may want to retransmit certain messages, not to lose information, or rather it needs to retransmit certain messages to ensure that it gets the information that it originally requested from the server. Yeah, next slide, please. So other things we did, we added a section about considerations for when you're using SHIC with OSCORE, because actually usage of SHIC can affect how often you need to perform rekeying operations. And basically this is because of two main reasons. Number one being that if you're using SHIC and you're compressing your partial IV, well, essentially now you have a smaller partial IV space, meaning that you have to now perform more frequent rekeying as you're working with a smaller space, and you will run out of partial IVs more quickly. And as it's also stated in the SHIC document itself, basically if you update your SHIC context rules, that means that you also need to perform a rekeying if you're using OSCORE to refresh your keys. Yeah, and we also did a lot of work on the OSCORE ID update procedure, specifically explaining in much more detail how this procedure works and how the message flow is meant to work, both for the reverse and forward message flow. So basically, either the server or the client can take the initiative to initiate this procedure. That's what we call the reverse and forward message flow. And we also have a detailed step-by-step narration for the examples. And we also showed that basically this OSCORE ID update procedure, it can be run completely standalone, and we designed it as a standalone procedure, but you may also want to integrate this in an execution of kudos. So not only are you updating your OSCORE security material, you're also getting new OSCORE sender IDs and recipient IDs. And we showed a more elaborate example now in Appendix A of how you can do this combination. And we've also added a lot more extended guidelines for considerations when you are running this procedure integrated in a kudos execution. Yeah, next slide. Another point, and I guess a minor change, but we extended the recipient ID option such that you can have length any. It used to be restricted to a specific length, but basically what we want to do is that this option can have some general usage, and there's no need in this document to restrict its size. So we specify it as any. However, when you're using it in the context of the ID update procedure, basically the maximum length of this option will be the maximum length of the OSCORE sender and recipient IDs. So when it's used in that context, it has a maximum length in practice, but there's no need to limit the actual option length. Next slide, please. Right, so now I wanted to go over some open points and points we would like feedback to from the group. And point number one is about this OSCORE ID update procedure. So as I mentioned, basically this is a procedure for the peers to renew their sender and recipient IDs, and it can be run completely standalone or embedded in a kudos execution. But I mean, fundamentally, it's a standalone procedure that is not really related to kudos. And what we would like to propose or get feedback to is if we should split this content into a separate working group document, such that we previously with the limits content. And we actually raised this in the past, and then it was a mild preference or no opinion to split it out. But basically what we concluded is that, well, let's revisit this question when we have extended and expanded this content, and, well, including all the content we had planned. And now we have come to that point, so we wanted to raise this again. because yeah, the procedure now includes all the information and it's fully featured, let's say. So the benefit here is that if we do split this out, this document would be, I mean, specifically targeted on kudos, and then we would have another document that's specifically about the ID update procedure. So yeah, Christian.
Christian Amthus. As I understand, there is one link between kudos and the key up and the ID update. That is, when you do successive ID updates, you have to keep a list of all your previous IDs until you do something like kudos. So the key update would for any practical implementation would still depend on the ability to do kudos and ideally to do that in one step. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, yes, if you do consecutive ID updates, basically you have to keep a list so that you ensure that you don't accidentally start, basically like you may otherwise accidentally choose an ID that you've been using in the past, and then you end up with a situation where you're kind of deriving, because the key derivation is based also on the IDs. So in such case, you would be deriving the exact same keys that you already used in the past. So basically, you would either need to keep this list and ensure that you don't, well, basically, you constantly keep a list, and the only way that you can clear the list is, as we've detailed, when you run an execution of kudos. So I suppose in that sense, that link exists in the meaning that, yeah, to clear that list, you would need to run kudos, or I suppose there are other ways, not necessarily kudos. I mean, I suppose if you ran something like ad hoc or such, I mean, that would also be a solution. Then it would be about essentially running something that refreshes your master secret.
Any other feedback input on the split in itself? And ultimately, Carsten, Jaime, what do you think should happen with this? Göran?
Yeah, I think the split makes sense to do. This is the confined functionality that it's well to describe in a separate draft, even if this case where you need to obviously keep track of what identifiers you have been using in either case. I don't see that as a reason to not split the specifications in two parts.
I think it's a good point that Christian had, but I guess if we do this split, of course, we should mention that, yes, you need to keep this list, but it's not exclusive that you must run kudos. It's really about, okay, you need to keep this list until you perform an action which updates your master secret, which could be kudos. It could also be ad hoc. It could also be, I mean, if you're using something like the Oscar ACE profile, etc. So it's tied to performing a functionality that updates your master secret, not necessarily kudos. But yeah, let me then go to the next slide.
Sorry, Carsten, Jaime, any view on that before we move on? Carsten, Jaime, can you? Oh, okay.
Unmute takes away today. Sorry, I used the big unmute, not the little unmute. I haven't made up my mind here. So I think it's important that we find homes for this work. The document splitting really is usually something that I like to do when the people working on the split out parts are different. I don't think that is actually the case here, so I'm not so entirely sure that we should be splitting this, but it also doesn't hurt. So yeah, again, I haven't made up my mind.
Not urgent.
Yep.
Thanks. Jaime.
Marco, in my case, to be honest, I haven't followed closely this draft, so I cannot recommend any direction whether it's splitting or not. But I can take an action to do that after this meeting.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Wait, yeah, let's then skip keep this open for further discussions. Yeah, next slide, please.
And don't mind the countdown too much. We are 10 minutes ahead.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. Yeah, another open point we had was we're defining this X byte in the extended OSCORE option. So basically we call it the X byte, but essentially what it does is it's a place where you can specify the size of the nonce. So you need to specify the size of the nonce to be actually able to parse the OSCORE option. And we also take advantage of this byte for certain flags in the context of the kudos execution. So currently we have 2 flags. Flag number 1 is about if you want to run kudos in the forward secrecy or no forward secrecy mode. And the forward secrecy mode is the main and the default mode you should run. The no forward secrecy mode is really for very, very constrained devices that may be unable to store information to non-volatile memory. And the other bit we have is about keeping observations after rekeying or not, because then there's special actions you need to take. But the idea here would be to define a registry for the X byte, which can aid in the future extensibility. And then one proposal would be to say that, yeah, in a similar way to what's done with the OSCORE flag byte, to say that we reserve bit 0 for future extensions, and we say that bit 1 and bit 8263 will be unassigned. So yeah, and okay, Christian?
As the person who is currently the expert on the outer registry here, I don't see that this brings much benefit over just using other bits of the OSCORE option here. Sure, there are 2 bits that could be used, but I think it would be fine if we just left them reserved. And if it turns out that there's really a use case that benefits from doing things here rather than in the OSCORE option, that document will just update this one and define the flags and be done with it. I think that's the most straightforward thing.
Okay, thanks for your feedback.
So do we know whether these bits must be 0, or are they ignored if they are set and not understood?
I don't recall, to be honest, exactly what we say regarding that. If we actually check them and say that it must be 0, I believe we do, but I would need to double check that in the text of the draft.
Yeah, that influences what these bits can be used for.
Yeah, so right. I mean, if we do want to leave this possibility open and we do add a registry, of course, we shouldn't. Then in the kudos document, we should be flexible enough to adjust the text accordingly to leave that door open.
Right.
But okay, yeah, can go next slide. Oh yeah, this was another point. So the question here is about when you are executing kudos and you're sending kudos requests, which is basically messages where you actually have the kudos related content in the OSCORE option filled out. Then the question is, if a client wishes to initiate kudos with the server, should it target a specific kudos type resource, or would it be fine if the client targeted any resource, even non-existing resources? And we kind of narrowed this down to 2 options. And option number 1 is that, well, yes, the client would need to send requests to a dedicated kudos resource. But the downside here is that this kudos resource may then need to interact in terms of code with methods in the OSCORE related code base. Or you can kind of reverse it and say that the OSCORE related code needs to be aware of which resources are kudos resources. And then we had option number 2, which then would be like similar to what is done in OSCORE Appendix B2, where the client's requests can target any resource, even non-existing resources. But the server should then not act on this request because that's not safe behavior. And when the response comes back, the client must ignore any payload in the responses. The downsides here is more that doing it like this may require modifications to the OSCORE library itself. I mean, essentially, like if we say that this should be about a standalone kudos resource, it may be possible to implement this having like an external OSCORE library, and you're only implementing this kudos logic in the kudos resource. But for option 2, if it's about, yeah, you can send the request to any resource, well, now you basically need to like intercept requests within the OSCORE library or within the OSCORE code itself to know when kudos should be triggered. So I would say both of these options, they would work. It's more like taking into account implementers and what would be way simpler and less of a burden on them. So here we'd also like, if anyone has any feedback on this point. Yeah, Göran?
Yeah, I sent a mail just before the meeting, which related, there were 2 points there. And one of the points was the question whether this would depend on whether it's the forward or the reverse flow, or if this is sort of generally applicable. For, I mean, in the reverse flow, that the first request from the client will be any resource, basically. So that
Yes.
we can decide. And for the forward flow, I think it would be perhaps simpler to have a dedicated resource. And in that case, the client is not intended to do anything except doing kudos, because that was the forward flow means. It's the client initiating the key updates. So I don't think there's a problem. I think there is an advantage of having a dedicated resource in that case.
No, I think it's a good point. I mean, basically, this solution can also be more flexible than what we've shown here. So you could have a kind of a hybrid approach where in the reverse message flow, you may go for one of the options, and you say that, yes, like in the forward message flow, yes, the client must send its request to a dedicated kudos option, but that does not hold true for the reverse message flow. And then this also can be combined with the concept that you know, an implementation may want to implement only the reverse or the forward message flow. So in the case an implementation is implementing only the forward message flow, and we say that, yes, you should target a dedicated kudos resource, then you may come to this possibly nice scenario where you could you don't even have to touch, you can use a third-party OSCORE library and implement all your kudos-related logic into the resource handler, which could have benefits for implementers.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, let's take the next slide.
Just to mention, Christian has an opinion, but he will follow up on the mailing list to avoid a too big detour.
Sounds good, because I think this point can require, let's say, a longer form discussion. Yeah.
Please do, Christian. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah. So I think this was the last update to be covered, but one thing that kudos allows is for retaining ongoing observations after a rekeying. And basically, when you do this rekeying, you create a new OSCORE security context, and that means that you reset your sender sequence number back to 0. However, this can have a negative effect in a certain situation where you're using observe, because the OSCORE observe notifications rely on the notification number for ordering an anti-replay. And in practice, the partial AV is used as a notification number. So if a pair resets their sender sequence number to 0, then they will start sending notifications with partial AV 0. And what we don't want to happen is that notification is then rejected by the other pair. Because at this point you will have actually performed the rekeying, so accepting that notification is safe. So to avoid this problem, basically what you would need to do is unset the notification number after you perform the rekeying, such that you reset it, and not only do you reset it, just resetting it back to 0 is not correct, because then it would be saying that partial AV 0 has already been received. So rather than setting it to a specific value, it's more about unsetting it completely, so it's not set at all. And because if you do this, then that first notification after rekeying with partial IV0 will be accepted as intended. So overall, the proposal here would be to say that when you perform a rekeying, when you create a new score security context, the notification number should be made as it's uninitialized, because otherwise you have this problem of notifications coming after rekeying being rejected while they should actually be accepted.
No one screams.
Now, let's take the next slide.
Comments? Okay.
Yep, summary and next steps. So what we want to do is address the open points that we presented here, of course, taking into account feedback. And yeah, otherwise we'll continue processing the open issues we have. They're all documented on the GitHub repository for the draft. And yeah, any comments and reviews are very welcome.
Yeah, Christian says he also had comments on the previous point, but I'll follow up on the list.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Christian. Okay, we are basically back perfect on time. So if there's no other comments and I see none, we can switch to the next presentation. There we are.
Right. Yes. So this is about another document, the OS Core Capable Proxies document. Next slide, please. Just to recap what this is about enabling the scenario where you can have communication using OS Core between a client and a proxy. I mean, as you all know, Co-op supports proxies that can be used between the client and the server. But what is not currently admitted or defined in OS Core is how a client and a proxy, or a proxy and a server, can use OS Core between each other. OS Core only considers the client and server as OS Core endpoints, and the proxy is just a relayer in the middle, not taking part of the OS Core related communication. And originally this started as an appendix of the core group com proxy document, but it was agreed in previous meetings that it's better to put this in a separate draft. Yeah, next slide, please. So basically the contribution is on 2 points. Point number 1 being to define the use of OS Core in a communication leg including a proxy. So this can mean between a client and a proxy, or a server and a proxy, or between different proxies. And yeah, essentially enabling the concept that not only client and server can be OS Core endpoints, but also that proxies should be able to be OS Core endpoints. And the second point is that admitting nested OS Core protection. So to enable this, I mean, if you have OS Core between the client and proxy, and then also between client and server, at this point you have multiple layers of OS Core protection in a nested manner. And the focus is on OS Core, but this would also be applicable to group OS Core. Next slide, please. And well, there are multiple relevant use cases for this kind of setup, where you would like to enable OS Core also for communicating with the proxy. I mean, some of these are listed here. You have, yeah, for instance, observe multicast notifications with group OS Core. You also have use cases related to lightweight M2M. And well, we go over all these use cases in these sections 2.1, 2.2, 2.5. So if you want more details on them, you can check. But there's a lot of relevant use cases where this can be very useful. Next slide, please. And as far as the actual content of the document, the message processing steps, that's well defined and stable. And there's no need for any kind of explicit signaling to guide the message processing. We have a high level algorithm defined that can, basically you can take that algorithm and then acting as a client, proxy, or server, that algorithm will guide you through the steps of the message processing. And we have a specific section that will cover each message and the direction of the message. And also we did get some recent comments from Christian, where we clarified that, well, one thing that we actually didn't say, but one, of course, a very big point of this draft is that this will enable the proxy to perform authorization checks of the incoming request, because now there is a security association between the client and the proxy. So the proxy is actually able to check if this client is authorized to use the proxy as a message relayer. Now we explicitly mention that, yes, indeed, that check is to be done. Next slide, please. And yeah, I won't go into this in detail, but these are the steps of processing an incoming request. So essentially, you start there in the top left corner with an incoming request, and then you need to check a number of things. First of all, you need to check if there are any proxy-related options, because then if you're a proxy, you may end up forwarding this request. And essentially, I mean, the way this is structured is like a recursion. So you see in the bottom right where it says decrypt, there's a blue arrow going back to are there proxy-related options. So you start over, and this is because, again, you can have this situation with nested layers of OSCORE protection. So each time you go through this flow, what you will end up doing is basically either running into some kind of error, or you will be decrypting one OSCORE layer, or you will be actually forwarding and sending this request out. But so if there was, you know, a 2-layer OSCORE protected message, well, you would go through twice, decrypting first, and then eventually you end up well, forwarding if you're a proxy, or you may end up actually processing that request if you're a server. But again, this is a flexible rule set suitable for client, proxy, and servers. Next slide, please. And some recent updates that already are present in version 6. We clarified there a bit on the OSCORE protection of co-op options in outgoing messages. So now we actually state that if you have an option originally defined as class U or I believe that the previous version, we only were covering class U options, but then we realized that, well, class I is also relevant, and that has also been added to the rule set for option processing. So one part of the document is basically like, how should you protect co-op options? Let's say you have a class U or class I option that's defined in OSCORE. Well, in certain situations, if you have the nested OSCORE, and now you're actually able to protect them as if they were class E options. And we also improved the general rules, covering some corner cases. And well, it's like a sanity check. We used the request hash option to understand if our rules for option processing was correct or not. And you can see the current rule formulation in section 3.1. There's basically 3 cases with some sub-bullet points. And overall, the design rationale is to try to encrypt as many options as possible. Of course, considering that the endpoints need to be able to see the option content in certain situations. Next slide, please. Yeah, in section 5, we also now added some guidelines on establishing OSCORE security contexts. I mean, overall, this document is really agnostic about how you originally established the context, but nonetheless, we wanted to cover that point. In the context of OSCORE, we have some guidelines if the client is using ad hoc. So you can do this kind of, let's say, nested execution of ad hoc, where you start by running ad hoc with a proxy to set up an OSCORE association client to proxy. And then as a next step, you use that first security association to run ad hoc between the client and the server through the proxy. And here you can also take advantage of this optimized ad hoc workflow we're defining in a separate document, core OSCORE ad hoc. And for group OSCORE, it's a bit more straightforward because you end up relying on the group manager. Next slide, please. Then we have some updates for version 7. So yeah, we expanded the use cases with two more use cases about the core performance measurements, and also EST over OSCORE when going over a co-op to HTTP proxy. And yeah, these documents also have an informative reference to this document. And we had some clarifications on group host score when group host score is used, thanks to Christian. And just to clarify, we had some kind of note previously saying that the proxies it's not allowed for the proxies to be part of the same OSCORE group as the server and client. But we realized that was too strong of a restriction, so that has been removed. We have some more security considerations in section 7. Some are inherited from group host score, some are inherited from OSCORE, and next slide, please. Yeah, we also have some considerations now on usage of SHIC. So compression of co-op headers, I mean, that's defined in RFC 8824. When you're using OSCORE, basically you have like an inner and an outer compression step for SHIC. And this new draft, the SHIC 8824 update, spells out how this is supposed to work with proxies. But what we want to clarify in this document is basically that we need a kind of a generalization for how to do SHIC compression when you have nesting of OSCORE compression, of OSCORE protection. It's not changing the core mechanics of SHIC, it's just considering the case of nested OSCORE protections. So basically, okay, how do you do it? Well, you have one inner SHIC compression step for each OSCORE layer, each layer of OSCORE protection that you apply. And basically, then each OSCORE endpoints will strip away that layer. But you always have only a single outer compression step that is done last after all the inner compressions. So it's using SHIC as is, it's just about defining how you do these inner and outer compression steps. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, more updates. We improved some notation in examples in Appendix A to make it easier to see. Like it can become a bit difficult to read because we have these, again, we have the nested protection of OSCORE, so it can be a bit hard to understand exactly which layer of OSCORE protection you're in now. So we improved that a lot. We also removed the old Appendix B that was pointing towards this concept of OSCORE protected unknown forwarding. That was decided during a previous interim to remove, but that has now been moved into a new experimental document in T2TRG. That's this T2TRG onion co-op document. You see there, reference 8. But then we added a new Appendix B, where we have some state diagrams showing the message processing. Basically, that figure I showed previously, we have ASCII art showing those steps and that flow. Yeah, next slide, please. And yeah, just to summarize, so this is about a proposed update to RFC 8613 to define how you're supposed to use OSCORE, to define and allow in the first place usage of OSCORE in a communication leg, including a proxy. And what this also does is explicitly admit nested OSCORE protection. So you have OSCORE in multiple layers. Again, you can have one layer between client and proxy and one layer then between client and server. So 2 layers for that particular message. And we kind of had a name for this that we considered it was this Matri OSCORE for this nested protection concept. And yeah, the benefit here also is that, I mean, this is mostly about, like we talk about OSCORE here, but this is also, I mean, seamlessly usable already also for group OSCORE. The actual mechanics and approach, they're stable. There's signal-free message processing. And again, our kind of guideline or like overall goal was to try to protect things as much as possible. So if we have a co-op option and it can be encrypted, it should be encrypted. Yeah, we also have some additional material about establishing OSCORE security context with proxies, as examples how you can set that up with EDOC and other solutions, considerations on SHIC like I mentioned, and examples of message exchanges, also showing, I would say, more advanced scenarios where you're using ad hoc in combination with this nested OSCORE protection. So again, you can set up ad hoc, you run it like client to proxy, and then you run ad hoc client to server, setting out both those associations using ad hoc. And yeah, I mean, at this point, we believe that this version 7 that we're at now, it's ready for a working group adoption call. So we would like to, to raise that to the group. And next slide, please. But it's over now. So yeah, thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Richard.
Hi there, I'm Matt Gilmore from Mitron. Thanks for your presentation. I'm also chair of the Lightweight M2M working group. And I was curious about one of your use cases where you described in section 2.4, Lightweight M2M gateway as a reverse proxy towards external end devices. Could you be a little more granular about that?
Yeah, I mean, we explained that in that section. I believe this use case originally came from
Slide 4.
No, slide 4, yeah. Right. So you were talking about the second one there. The Lightweight M2M server uses the Lightweight M2M gateway as a reverse proxy towards external end devices.
That's pretty ambiguous.
I guess it's a bit ambiguous here. To be honest, I'm not a Lightweight M2M expert. We did get this as a specific point of feedback from one individual that was involved in Lightweight M2M, and they seem to have this use case in mind as a specific use case. But I think, okay, like we definitely elaborate on this in the text and explain this in more detail, what we actually mean by this.
Yeah, as a maintainer of Lightweight M2M,
I'm
like, I've never heard of this.
The input came from David Navarro. David Navarro,
okay.
Yeah, is discussed in the draft. If you're using co-op, the Lightweight M2M gateway is practically a co-op reverse proxy. So you may want to keep talking to the gateway and with the end devices behind it with these sort of security associations in place.
Okay, maybe perhaps my mistake. I'm a little hung up on that bullet point because it really threw me off.
No, but thanks for feedback. I think it's important that, yeah, of course, this is understandable to the people working on these things. So we should definitely elaborate on this and explain it better. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There's Karsten in the queue now.
Yeah, so without my working group chat on, I think this is really necessary work, and it does fill a gap that we have had before. And I also think that the document is definitely in a state where it shows the direction that this work will take. I actually think it's already way beyond that. And so I'm very much in favor of adopting this draft.
Thanks, Karsten. Göran?
Thank you. Göran Selander. So just on the point on the Lightweight M2M scenario, if I remember right, this was a long time ago. There was a requirements phase in the device management service enablement group, and that was looking at the situation where you have an application server talking to a Lightweight M2M management server talking to Lightweight M2M client. And the question was, how do we enable end-to-end security between the application server and the client? Because in the scope of Lightweight M2M is essentially the protocol between the Lightweight M2M server and the Lightweight M2M client. So that's as far as I can recall the question about how this use case came into the picture for this. I don't know if that rings a bell to people involved in Lightweight M2M today.
Yeah, I think definitely one thing we could do here is revisit this with David and try to flesh this out a bit more and come back to him and see to bring him into this discussion to expand on this text.
Sorry for the minutes. Can you state your name again? Just for the minutes, we missed it.
I'm Matt Gilmore. I'm with Itron.
Just to be 100% sure.
Gilmore is how I'm registered.
Thanks.
To your comment, Goran, if I may.
Please.
I know the whole point is end-to-end security with OSCORE, and that's why I'm really confused about that use case about Light Window Twin Gateway as a reverse proxy to external end devices. What does that really mean?
I can't explain that part, but I'm trying to recall where this originates from. It was a requirement for. I mean, there was a requirements phase like 5 years ago or something, and this was one of the use cases looking at how you handle the end-to-end security and the formulation with reverse proxy. I don't know. That doesn't come from the requirement. I'm pretty sure that's something that's an interpretation of that.
Yeah, again, I think this is based on that discussion with David Navarro, and but let's come back to him regarding this. And I think we can flesh it out and explain it better. Yeah.
I just quickly noticed Christian in the queue for a second. Do you want to say anything, Christian?
No, got handled.
Okay. Okay, if there are no other comments, I think it's on Carsten Jaime to think on any follow-up here. Okay. Thank you.
Maybe we actually do want to get a sense of the room. So we can do the adoption call based on the sense of the room. So before I ask that, who has read version of this document? Maybe I don't have to run a poll, just do a +1 in the chat. So I see one person who has read it. Jöran has read it. Yeah, the authors, I hope, have read it. Laurent has read it. Very good. Okay, so we do have some reception in the working group. So let me ask the question: who would object to adoption of this draft in this working group? Come to the mic or say something in the mic, in the chat. Okay, and now I actually have to pull out this poll tool. Sorry, I haven't used this in a while. So here's the poll. I hope you can see that. Sorry for the short question. I didn't want to copy the draft name. Okay, so I think it fits with having about 5 people read it, that we have about 6 hands here. So I think that is a useful result we can use, and we can base the poll, the confirming poll on the mailing list on this result. Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay, last but not least, Christian.
I won't give and all of the developments.
Christian, your video and audio is chopping quite a lot. Better
Okay,
now, yes.
It's dark anyway. One issue to address was about discovery. if I'm in a situation where I'm opening my cell phone browser, whatever, I'm trying to see what is there that I can connect to, things worked fine. If I already knew what to connect to, not so much, because much information would only have been available after a connection was established. That connection establishment would be easy, but still it would take time and it would be a manual process, especially from a browser. So the main update in -04 was that there is now semantics for the service data field, which is part of Bluetooth Low Energy advertisements, that says, hey, running this service, I'm telling this and that information about me. And consequently, that could easily be hacked into the address. So as the result of that, the address format changed a bit. And now the proposed format, even when service data is not used, is core plus that /BLE. And I think that .BLE.ARPA or the ARPA and URI scheme things generally are what we should talk about today. So just for context, the previous idea was to have core plus get : / and then the address just as a hex string. So what motivated the change right now, apart from having had both parts around and having to decide on one, is that right now we're having two means of identifying a device. One is that it could be identified by its MAC address, and that is useful for some kinds of applications, but other applications can't use that at all. And those other applications would typically have those self-described names from the service data field available. So we already have two kinds of binary data that need to be matched into addresses. And that would be afforded by having, for example, a .ble.arpa and a .ble sd.arpa. SD for what's the term, service data. Of course, the other approach would have worked too, but if we look at how URIs are usually used, sure, 3986 says it's something can resolve, but in practice, authority components with the core key means try to use the URI style core //host.example.com, or conversely // something.ble.arpa. I wouldn't rule those out. I don't find either of them particularly useful. I'm missing. I thought I had one more slide here. I'm a bit confused. Either way, the steps to explore have been cut down a bit. So a few of the options are things that I would like to keep for further exploration, possibly outside of that document. And yeah, that's where we are. The question about working group adoption has been raised in the previous meeting already on with draft 03. The situation hasn't changed much then, in that there is no current implementation of -04, but I'd like to bring that up in one of the next interims. That's it from my side, and I guess we will continue on the URI scheme question, because that is the. I hear Carsten having a question here.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I just want to mention that this was exactly the reason why I put locally defined URIs on the agenda for Friday, because I think there are a lot of ways to fry this particular egg, and it may be a bike shed to a certain extent. It may have advantages, disadvantages. So there are other places. So, for instance, we have these beautiful FE80 URIs with link identifiers in them and so on. And maybe we want to have a common idea in the core working group to have these locally valid URIs as part of the architecture.
Yeah, they definitely fall into this. FE80 URIs fall into the same category. Yes, that is something that we should talk about at some point. I just wanted to briefly add that slide that for some reason I think MetaCore wasn't refreshed, was missing. There would be one more option around this using kind of for URIs here, that is our C9839 with its def URNs. But as I understand, there is just no clean way to get the to use a URI in the authority component. And the generic ones are messy, and the non-generic ones, like if we start doing something custom, I think we can just as well go full custom and have ble.rper-ish identifiers.
Yes, Matthew?
Using a Matt Gilmore, using a MAC address as part of your URN is like,
are you saying about? Did you say URN or URL? So
it looked like a URN. Could be
well,
URL
as for the URNs, well, that is at least something that has been defined and is in wide use, as far as I understand. So as for the use in the URL, as it is also proposed not only on the URN slide, it will make some sense for some situations and not for others. I would treat it as similar to the use of an IP address in a URL. So if I'm using the URLs as they are intended and follow the cool URIs don't change document around W3C, then I would use neither a MAC address or an IP literal. For the local communication.
Right, assuming you're using CoAP, or assuming you're using CoAP.
No. Okay.
And you're putting the MAC address.
I should take a step back here. So that's essentially what I skipped around the background. CoAP over GATT is not an IP-based transport. CoAP over GATT is a particular transport, particularly intended for devices that have no way of doing proper IP communication with the device that is within their radio range, and is thus defined over Bluetooth Low Energy GATT, which does not transport IP at all. So it is, in a sense, it is similar to CoAP over WebSockets, where you have a user that is constrained not by its resources and energy level and so on, but by the environment it is running on. Typically, like running in a web browser where it doesn't have access to all those nice things like the IP stack and the UDP protocol, but it only can use what is within the web browser. And in that case, it's either CoAP over WebSockets for communicating with a server somewhere in the cloud, or BLE with a device that is nearby, and there is no IP involved in CoAP over GATT. So the MAC address is actually the only address that is usable in that context.
Carsten, you're still in the queue. You want to say something?
No. Why am I in the queue?
And Joran has also the mic open. Joran, any comment? No.
Okay. Just for illustrative purposes, I'd like to share screen again with the slide from an earlier presentation on that same topic.
Yes.
That's the context a bit. So when using Bluetooth LE, the option I would recommend is just use IP over BLE, and then you can use CoAP over UDP. There are alternative proposals that do a full IP stack over GATT, proposed I think by the Fitbit people. but that requires having a full, basically a full IP stack in JavaScript in the web browser, or as the alternative, and this is on the left what I'm presenting here, having a transport of CoAP that is clearly distinct from CoAP over UDP. It's not much different in the sense that there are other transports that are running over other things. CoAP over SMS has been proposed. CoAP over narrowband IoT is used in lightweight M2M, and CoAP over serial has been around as a draft as well. And none of those are running over IP, but they are using the addresses that are around on that particular medium, and that particular medium being BLE GAT. BLE MAC addresses are what is around. And the transport indication draft provides means of using different URIs in that context if those locally significant URIs, thank you, Carsten, for the name, are not suitable in longer range communication.
Thanks, Christian. So something will follow up this Friday, something will come back at interim meetings. Okay, we are perfectly on time to wrap up and close this meeting. Any last minute comment, input? Yes, and a reminder again. Thanks, Jaime, for reminding me to remind again. We have a core informal site meeting on Friday. Check the chair slides for more details and the wiki page on the site meetings at 117. That's it. Thank you all for your time, participation, and great work. Enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you. Goodbye.
See you at the interim meetings.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.